Worked with the I worked with the UNDP and the government programs, the Planning Commission in the past, to integrate the issues of gender, natural resource, and livelihoods, and found that not much space was there for women's voices, women's priorities, and budgets for women to come into those processes of planning and prioritization. And through my training programs with the Government of India, these were issues that I was trying to highlight. So I've tried to continue that kind of foray of bringing research, policy, as well as community voices to the debates that are ongoing to influence planning and processes for engagement with livelihoods, forest rights, and development. Thank you. Anuja?
Yeah. Can I share my screen?
Sure.
So I'm Anuja, and I'm from the Forests and Governance program from ATREE. I'm studying community-based forest management, basically in areas which have received forest rights. So forest rights is an act in India which was aimed to restore rights of forest dwellers who were denied access to management and ownership rights to their forests. And after this act has come into place, communities can claim right to their traditional forest areas and then get into more localized kind of management practices. So I'm studying this in Gadchiroli district in Maharashtra, which is in the central Indian dry deciduous forest zone. And it has some of the highest areas under the Forest Rights Act. Until recently, it was one of the leading districts where with communities getting the maximum number of CFR or the community forest rights in India. And here I'm focusing on local decision making for forest management with 3 dimensions on sustainability of resources, the kind of livelihoods they generate, and whether there is equity in benefit sharing. I do this through an analysis of the trade in tendu leaves. So tendu is one of the important commercial NTFPs in India, and it is in this particular region, it is like the most important NTFP here. And what I'm trying to see is what kind of federations have been formed in this region of harvesters of tendu leaf, and how they are actually creating social change and in the region, bringing in diverse perspective, not just related to non-timber harvest, non-timber forest produce harvest, but also in terms of mobilization and getting in more women's participation as well, apart from other kind of political spaces that these federations are creating. So, and at the village level, I focus on how these kind of influences of the federation also impact decision making within the village, that is the Gram Sabha level, and also because of this trade that is happening independently now of the state, and funds are being created at the village level, whether these funds then get invested meaningfully in creation of rural infrastructure that has meaning within the village, especially for, say, women as well. Whether these kind of funds that are created create some sort of investment that is the labor of women or not. So this is one of the aspects that I'm studying through my PhD. So
Great.
Thank you.
You would like to add on, Somaji, about your approach in when all your experiences with regard to forest policy for the audience to know your background a bit more.
Okay. Well, I have been particularly interested in the management and conservation of natural resources from a gender perspective. And my work on that is, much of it has been from a commons lens, but my analytical framework has shifted to a feminist political ecology, because I found that the commons lens was really not adequately addressing the gender dimensions within the framing that we have from the common school of thought. And much of what I have been doing by way of research has been to foreground how gender is even looked at within the realms of policy and policy in practice. So my research for my PhD was also about looking at forest policy in Rajasthan and the practice of policy at the ground level as functionaries understand it, as it is portrayed and represented in the kind of dynamics and social relations that it creates, and political relations, power relations at the community level. So understanding that, I believe, is very important for how we traverse the arena of policy shifts to engage with conservation, engage with ecological restoration work, which we are setting ourselves for in the next decade. And I would really like to foreground that in our conversation today about how forest policy has really been much more about extractivism and about development taking a front seat, with environment really being bearing the brunt of it, and those who are dependent upon the environment for their subsistence needs. Perhaps I should share my screen here. Those people who are most dependent on the forests, for instance, who are in this situation of having to forage and can you see my screen? Yeah. So for communities, we are our approach really is about enabling women and communities to come forward in leadership, to engage with the agenda of environment and forestry, and to for them to be able to engage, to create platform spaces and opportunities for discourse, for engagement with public policy and with state agencies. And how we do that is through the rubric of voices, resources, and bodies. Because currently, I'm sure voices would be easy to understand, building up agency, voice for women in representative politics and in decision-making forums. Resource rights are very important for women in terms of their engagement with resources to be able to claim and to take decisions, autonomy about those resources, to be able to manage their lives as well as the lives of their communities while being engaged with the ecology of the region. Because every time we talk about forest resources and rights claiming, women have always come back with the point, but we are part of that system, and therefore in managing, restoring and sustaining that is part of what we see as the legacy of a forest right. So it's in that context, I feel we really need to foreground that kind of engagement. Also looking at how bodies are enmeshed in these processes, how violence, for instance, within these communities and by state actors and the mafias of the corporate sector are really impinging upon the lives of these people, and especially upon the women, to threaten them in these processes of rights claiming and restoring to themselves what has been taken away through the colonial project and through the post-colonial project in what we call the free India. For them, the word freedom has meant a loss of their own resources, livelihoods, and their own means of living. And it's very important to locate, therefore, their understanding of how they understand these, how they view these resources that we're talking about as heritage. I mean, these women, these are clips from a film that has been made on the Dongaria Khond community in Odisha, where they talk about the biology My biological mother may have given me birth, but the forest mother has sustained me. In another clip, she says that I get all what I need from this. Why do I need to look elsewhere? My concern is that my son should also be able to feed himself and subsist from this and sustain this for the future generations. And here we find that she says that even if it is a bad year, I know that that nature itself will give me something, and I only need that for my sustenance. So she's not looking at the commodification of nature as timber. She's not looking at the extraction of surplus for profit. She's looking at subsistence and perhaps a little more to sustain manage a process of living that allows her communities around her, as well as all the species within the forests and around them, to be able to sustain. So when they raise issues of the forest and of the elephants invading the forest, it's from a sense of deep sorrow that this engagement has caused imbalance because of the kind of processes in the name of development that are ongoing currently. And this photograph, I really wanted to start with this, is if you see this woman with the claim document in her hand, it gives her great sense of joy, autonomy, independence to have something on her name. But it also tells her, and she articulated this herself, that it is a right to restore to the forest what we have taken from the forest. So it is that symbiosis between nature and self within nature that we are talking about in terms of an ecological perspective. We can talk further on any of these issues. I think I should give Anuja the floor. Yeah, Anuja. Should I start?
Before Anuja takes on the floor, it would be nice, Soma, if you could help explain the audience a little bit more about the claims, because it might not be, we have a global audience and it might not be very clear what do we mean by, who's claiming and from whom. So it would be nice.
Thank you for giving me that window. Yeah, so India has a very positive enactment which has been brought in place in 2006 after a lot of mobilization and advocacy by the community-based organizations and movements for forest rights and forest governance by communities. It resulted in the enactment of the Forest Rights Act, which entitles communities, including women. For the first time, women are recognized as rights holders to individual forest rights, which is to be able to claim for themselves through a process of self-demarcation, a plot of land, a space within the forest from which they can sustain their lives and livelihoods for their use, and to be able to restore to themselves the sense of relationship with the forest, as well as the resources and the bounty from the forest to manage their own lives. Apart from this, the Act also provides for community forest rights. Therefore, it recognizes the community's claim to the forest resources and to the forest territories around them. And these are communities that are dependent on those forests around them. So much of these lands had already been brought under the domain of the Forest Department by virtue of the Forest Conservation Act and other enactments of the Government of India. But recognizing the historical injustice that has been done to indigenous communities in declaring the forest as eminent domain, this enactment has actually sought to reverse that process. However, this act has also led to a lot of contentious reactions and response from the bureaucracies, particularly the technocracies within the forest departments. Though I must add that there are also very sensitive officers who recognize that the ecologies and the ecological restoration of forests is hugely dependent and relies upon the communities that have been managing and maintaining these forests for centuries. So the Act recognizes those communities, gives them a space at the table, allows them to plan and manage their community forests through a community forest management plan, which is then discussed with their own communities and at district levels as well. The state is also a part of that forum where these claims are recognized. And the purpose was for collaborative democracy to come into play and for communities to have a role in the management of resources, in the governance of forests, in the conservation of forests, and to decide what needs to be extracted to what extent to bring about this harmonious ecological agenda. Unfortunately, much of the Forest Rights Act provisions have not been implemented in the spirit and on the scale that they were anticipated. It is only where civil society organizations and movements claiming forest rights and governance have been able to create spaces for communities to organize and understand the legal provisions and be able to engage with them. And we have had a few progressive bureaucrats and technocrats who have supported this process, that this right has been able to be claimed by communities. To a much lesser extent, not even 3% has been claimed in the according to the latest estimates of the community forest rights. So this is a work in progress, and a lot of progress needs to be made. So I really appreciate this forum where we can talk to foresters, talk to people who are engaging with foresters to build this understanding of how communities, and particularly women, can lead this process of community restoration of forests and claiming the autonomy to live with the forests as their heritage has been. I think it's important to see both those, the social relations with the forest and the sustenance of the forest themselves, as interconnected issues. Yeah, so they don't see their lives and their livelihoods as something that is separate. The women are engaged in all kinds of activities and are very conscious of the produce that they bring from the forest to allow the forest to regenerate, to procreate, and themselves to be able to sustain from that process. I'll stop here.
Perfect. Thank you so much. You gave this entire background to where we stand with regard to forest rights, and in particular with community and individual and within individual with regard to women's rights to the forest, both collective and individual rights. Anuja, you want to share your experience from the field?
Before we switch to Anuja, I'd just like to talk about Navli Ben. This is Navli Ben in the pink sari in the middle. She's part of the community forest rights, the forest rights committee in the village. She's also part of the Panchayati Raj Gram Panchayat, and is currently very engaged in our ATREE project as she engages with these issues to take forward such agendas. And we are working to organize such women into leadership and look forward to engaging with you on these processes as we go along.
For those who are unversed with the Gram Sabha and the Panchayat, it's a local democratic institution at the village level. So that's quite an important body in the village level. Anuja, you want to share your experience from the field?
Yes, actually, what Sobaji shared about women leaders, it's quite important, especially in the context where communities have now rights to manage their forests. What we see in a lot of places, traditional communities are very highly structured, male-dominated, and often there's very little voice for women to participate even within the village itself. So the leadership of women and grouping of women together, networking women into places where they can empower themselves and then bring back that kind of knowledge and understanding into their own villages is very important. What I remember one situation where men would keep discussing about a lot of issues that they face within their for managing their forest, whether there are new schemes coming up, a mine coming up, or there's some conflict about land within their village, and there's a debate happening around, and women would often not get to participate in such things because they don't know, they have not studied the law, they've not they don't know enough. But then what next? Women need to know, and women need to participate, and these kind of networks of women across these community groups is very important to create these spaces for women to learn and then engage at their village levels. So that, I think, that is the way forward for us. Even when we say community forest rights, we also need to engage very strongly on women's rights within communities when we go in this direction. That's.
Sorry, is my screen visible?
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No worries.
Okay. Anuja, just to supplement the point that you were making about how dominant patriarchal frameworks have really come into their own in these areas. The footprint of patriarchy as well as capitalism have really worked together to create these kind of dominant hierarchies at the political, economic, and social level, with patriarchy bringing them all together to play out on women's lives and bodies, even at the community level and in the household level. So that where women earlier had access to the resources, would sit in community meetings, now those rule structures and those processes have become much more rigid and therefore become much more difficult for women to transact. This slide I particularly wanted to show. Let me just get to slideshow. This, yeah. This is these are women who were recently at a training program on community-based livelihood systems focused on uncultivated foods in the COVID period. I'm sure this webinar is also focused on COVID. I thought it was relevant to bring this up here. We've been having these workshops, particularly for communities, to have intergenerational dialogues, because a lot of the young people have been migrating out of the tribal areas in search of work because the forests around them in their vicinity have been enclosed. And when forests are enclosed, then communities are distanced from those forests physically as well as emotionally. And the symbolisms may continue, but the knowledge transfer and the symbolic knowledge system transfer really doesn't happen within the community. So the loss of culture, when they move out of their own vicinity, out of their own landscape, into landscapes very often in urban areas or as agricultural labor, wherever they can earn a wage to sustain their households, is extremely devastating. And in those situations, these are the women who are told that they are now criminals in their own forests because they try to evade the forest guards and try to track their beats to be able to go and forage for the things that they need from the forest, simply because this is something that they have been doing forever. And simply because this is not something that they see as against the nature, but as part of the rhythm of nature itself. And when they're called criminals, and the largest number of criminal cases in India are against women who have tried to gather resources from the forest, the National Crime Research Bureau, which used to be there and is now merged into other data management structures of the government, had shown in 1916 that women were the largest number against whom the cases were filed for this kind of crime. And that this is considered a crime, and the forest in my own research, I found the tehsildar saying that these are not their territories, these are properties of the state. I found the forest guards and the forest rangers saying that they are illegally going into these places. So we have to snatch their kulhari, which is their small pickaxe, and take them away from them and then charge them a fine. These are acts of actually alienating them from resources and playing a role in actually ensuring sustenance. Because I have often walked with the women in the forest and seen how they would, if they see a twig broken somewhere, they would try and fix it. If they see a root, goats have gone through an area and they see roots exposed, they would just press it with their feet so that the soil will protect them. And these are acts of ecological restoration, everyday acts of ecological restoration, which are seldom recognized by state institutions in their prototype and their area planning approaches, where they are seeing themselves as the vanguards, whereas communities have been doing that all the time. And it is women who have been doing that most of the time, because they know that the meal for the next year and the next year and the sustenance of their animals and their biodiversities is what is keeping them going as a society. So this kind of symbiotic understanding is something that we really need. But of course, along with that, new knowledge has been very important. We see here the photograph at the bottom right is of women learning how to make matka khad, which was not something that they had in their knowledge, which is the organic fertilizer from the mix of various natural produce, such as the urine of cows, for instance, into a mix which is then used for their vegetable gardens, for their kitchen gardens, which they have started during the COVID time, close to their homes so that they could deal with the lockdown if it ever occurred again. So we have started seed banks and knowledge building on herbs as well as on forest produce, so that there is a possibility of sustainable resources. And the other group that you see here is communities. The person here is Surly born in the northeast area of Assam of India. And she is hosting a meeting here where communities are sharing knowledge and practices of other areas, including Gadchiroli. And we have this kind of knowledge exchange happening every month across communities in 6 states through our ATREE process. Yeah. So, and all through virtual links, so that they come into meetings like this and we can connect with them. Their areas weren't so COVID infested in the first round. So it was possible at that time.
Right. Anuja, would you like to share your experience of during the COVID, like as a researcher, as a PhD student, like, how did you, as a person, you cope with this entire pandemic situation, and what did you see in in your study area, which is in the Western India, Gadchiroli, and how did the community cope?
So luckily, I was on field when the lockdown happened, and I could trace the kind of confusion that happened with this whole business of inside and outside. Is a forest outside or is it inside? So when you go collecting forest produce, you're going outside, and in the initial phases of the lockdown, even that kind of movement was not allowed. And this particularly the lockdown happened in the main harvest season in the region that I study in. So that's the time when mahwah, which is a flower which is traded quite often, tendu is all harvested at that particular time. And then this whole confusion about whether forestry is an activity that is agricultural, which was permitted or not, happened. And there needed to be a lot of lobbying to make sure that this continues. And
maybe you can also explain a little bit about what is the role of mahwah, and in terms of for our general audience who would like to know, because these are the non-timber forest produce, which is very important and part and parcel of livelihood of the indigenous communities in the area, and particularly women. So you might want to highlight a bit on that.
Mahwah is a flower from a particular deciduous tree, and this flower is used for is very important in religious function of the communities that also occupy this area. But it is primarily harvested for producing alcohol, and it traditionally was used for production of flour, which they used for making breads, and also for the seed is used for making oil, which was the most common oil used in this area. But with time, this particular forest produce has been labeled as just for liquor basically, and all other things have like all its other uses have been replaced by products which are considered more upper class, which is wheat and the groundnut oil and other kinds of oil. So mahwah is now very particularly traded for liquor, but still it's one of the biggest income generating forest products in the area. And it's particularly harvested in the month of March, and then it is stored, and then for some people it's like it's a produce which they can sell when they need cash, so you can store it for some time. And women especially would for them it's like it's a source where whenever for like a safety net, so whenever they need cash incomes, it is used. But COVID-19 really changed this. The main forest harvest time was very confusing. Of course it later relaxed and people could do it, but especially because I studied Tendu, I know a little bit about it. Tendu auctions happened earlier in March, and then the leaf is sold to the trader but harvested in the month of May. But with the lockdown, the trade and lockdown being so strict that the traders couldn't come to the village to buy this particular product, a lot of villages couldn't sell their Tendu at all. And then so obviously the harvest also reduced that year. Sometimes villages had to settle for really throwaway prices, and of course that impacts the village community as a whole, but women as well, because the main harvesters are women who work like from 4 o'clock in the morning going in the forest and harvesting this particular leaf, because this particular leaf, in fact, Tendu is also used for agriculture. So the income that is coming from Tendu is then, which comes at the particular May period, which is pre-monsoon. This income is then invested in agriculture. So a loss in the incomes from forest is also a loss in agriculture. And we really don't know what kind of, we don't have a number on this, what kind of compensation will be required for this kind of complete lockdown that happened in India.
Just to add to what Anuja was saying about Tendu, women have made, when left to women, there's a village called Panchgaon very close to where Anuja works for her research. Since they are part of our network, I'm aware of that. They have made the decision not to pluck the Tendu leaves, but instead to allow the Timru fruit to flourish, because they feel that that is better for the forest, for eco-regeneration. So there should be a controlled harvest of the Tendu. So while the community, forest community was actually trying to make these decisions, the women came into the leadership of that committee and have decided not to pluck the Tendu for 2-3 years, to allow the forest to propagate and to be able to regenerate, so that there is not this kind of denudation of the forest that occurs. And these are the kind of decisions that we are talking about, informed on their knowledge and their understanding of how to manage the resource with a long-term view in mind, that they are making these choices when they are in the decision-making process. Similarly, another point that Anuja raised was about how the forest department interacts with the communities. We are seeing much more demand from the forest department to arm themselves. In the Assam area particularly, we've seen this. Every forest plan in every state has talked about getting more guns, getting more cameras in place, putting more traps in place. And this is really about the masculinist militarization of the forest regime. where communities are seen as the outsider, and the forest department itself becomes the aggressive claimant of the protective role. And this is really an aberration. Protection through arming itself is really a militarization of conservation. And if these practices continue, then the sustainability of forests and the sustenance of forest communities becomes far greater. India's percentages of malnutrition have grown remarkably with this kind of stringent militarization of conservation. And yet there are examples of community-based conservation which are evident in different parts of the country, which serve as very good examples of how this could actually be done. And there are foresters who have worked with communities to make this happen. So I think it's important to showcase this and bring it into the teaching processes and curriculum of the forest department itself, so that the policies are then informed in this kind of nuanced way of what needs to be protected, what needs to be conserved, and how communities can be at the center of conservation processes.
This brings me to my next follow-up question to you, Soma. What is one thing that, you talk about role of women in forest policy, and how women's input has already been there, as you have expressed in your presentation, and Anuja, like they are there in the field, they are protecting and conserving and are involved in collective forest management, and in all these efforts, women play a very significant role in kind of ensuring the forest is being protected. Yet there is all the militarization that we are talking about, only to ensure that they don't have access from the forest producers, which are the basic necessity of the people who are forest dependent. To come back to my question is that, what is one thing that in the forest policy that you would like to see a change, or more very like we always talk about problems, but is there something that a solution that we can which we can offer and that it's available?
Okay, it's very difficult to narrow it down to one point. I could talk about the Forest Rights Act being such a progressive act, as I have said. But the Forest Rights Act also draws the line at the role that women can play in the forest governance for community forest governance. So that was one agenda we are working on currently. How do we represent this issue? But on the other hand, the forest regime is controlled by the forest department, and the policy is written for the forest by the Forest and Environmental Department in India. We call it the Ministry of Forests and Climate Change, Environment, Forests and Climate Change. So it's a long name. But given its mandate, I think it's very important for them to start realizing and recognizing how the Forest Conservation Act needs to be about communities and conservation through a democratic, decentralized, locally managed process. I think that is the one, umbrella issue that will solve a lot more problems. And that, I think, the Forest Rights Act has given us the possibilities. It points to the potential of what can happen if the Forest Conservation Act itself policy is brought into a framework of democratic, people-based engagement with forests. Currently, they have policies like the CAMPA policy, which is, compensatory afforestation, where they, if you read more about this policy, you will learn that this is a policy which allows people who want to divert forests for other uses, such as mining, such as cement factories, such as infrastructure projects. And with often these projects are undertaken without the due diligence of clearances and consent from the community if they're declared as linear projects or they're declared as state in the national interest and for national security. So communities de facto become displaced and can only ask for compensation. But if the Forest Rights Act is implemented in a spirit of community engagement with women at the helm of things and central to the decision making on that table for decision making, then things will definitely be much more ecologically sustainable. And we are happy to engage with this process if the state is willing to discuss how this can be taken forward, to engage for a policy and to demonstrate how this can happen. The Forest Department has policies like the Joint Forest Management policy, but that's very piecemeal and is only seeing people as labor. It does not engage with knowledge systems, wisdoms, and truths about their own processes of how they restore and how they manage the forest. So to get to that fact of how communities can engage is very critical for how forests can sustain.
Right. Anuja, you want to share your experience? Like, you are a young PhD candidate and you are getting into this academic field, and also you are seeing the as a practitioner, like what are the challenges? So from your perspective, what would be a kind of, I mean, I'll say one solution or a way forward for ensuring that, you know, women's role are like inclusive in the forest policy?
Right. So yeah, I agree with this place at the table idea a lot, and often we focus on the village level, and there should be more participation of women within villages. But also, if you look at the Ministry of Forest and Climate Change, you see that a lot of committees have men. The central agents, the Environment Appraisal Committee, the Forest Advisory Committee are all men. And really, are we then asking for place at the table even in these committees? You know, even from the top, we need more women's representation in these committees as well. So place at the table, and also voice at the table, definitely. When I don't know if just women's participation is going to change the kind of narrative within the Forest Department to a very conservation oriented, woman oriented, but at least we should be there. Women should be there at these tables as well. So that is one. And definitely wherever we get a chance, we should just go there and talk. I mean, for me, even this act of coming and speaking here at so early in my career is also an act of taking the mic and saying, yes, I should be heard. And that's a practice that we need to do everywhere, wherever we have the privilege to do that. I think that's the one thing which we should change about ourselves as well.
That's fantastic. Just before the webinar, we were discussing about with Somaji, like, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, we wouldn't see so many women in academic working on forest and land tenure issues. And now you see a lot more. And I hope that in some way, this also influences the way women's role in forest policy is being managed, and not just in a generic sense, but also uplifting the local community women's role in this entire forest policy. I think we have enough time for opening up to take some questions from the audience, and it would be nice to have dialogues. I already see a couple of chats in the chat box. So I'll open up the floor for the audience questions. So please feel free to raise your hand.
Should we take the ones in the chat first?
We can take that, yes. Do you want to start with the chat?
Sure.
Yeah, good.
Sure. Thank you so much for your questions. This issue of loss of culture, I think it's important to understand the anthropological and the epistemic roots of culture itself, to understand that there is a generation upon generation that accumulates experience of a relationship with an environment, with a landscape. And that accumulated knowledge system creates a practice of living and markers and events that will celebrate that practice of living, which we call culture. This is what I have understood from the women that I work with. And when the culture is seen as a celebration, it's seen as a celebration of the embeddedness within a social, ecological context, and creating the symbolic social event to mark that, the cultural context for it. So the forms of dance, for instance, are very much about the community practice of living in the Adivasi areas. It's always about the Jhod. And the Jhod is about linking the arms and seeing the connectivity of the human spirit and the environmental spirit. It is in our conversations with communities, it's been much more about how communities have sustained the resource. It has been very little about households, and yet all our planning processes for poverty eradication, for livelihoods, eco-regeneration, for kitchen gardens with the NABARD, which is the lead rural development bank in India, is always, how will this happen at the household level? Women are talking and learning and speaking and engaging about these issues at the household level. Men, on the other hand, are worried about how their families, their properties, and their structures of power can be managed, reinforced, and retained. And this is the mindset that constrains us from an ecological worldview. And for men also, it constrains them from being able to live with their systems of resources in an ecological way. Patriarchy itself, coupled with capitalism, distances communities from their resources. And it's important to understand this interplay to be able to understand how culture plays a symbolic role. So I don't know how to pronounce your name. Would you like to help me? It's important to get. Oindrila, thank you so much for that question. I think it's a very important part of how we understand communities themselves. It is the embedded nature of their existence and their everyday practice of livelihoods that they celebrate through symbolic meaning embedded within the cultural practices that they've evolved that allow us to understand the relationships. And when those relationships are broken, we find that they go totally asunder. And we find that when they migrate to the urban areas and as labor, they still go in that kind of collectivity. They still want to come back to that solidarity of the community space, because that is their memory, that is their history, that is their sense of belonging. But the compulsion to earn a living when they are denied that connectivity to their resources is what creates the disruptures in the cultural ethos as well. We're hoping that post-COVID learning can be much more about restoring these cultural and ecological practices through the cultural, through the cultural renewal of wisdoms. There's more to your question. Is there any part of it you would like to highlight?
I think just one more addition here, like, what you have mentioned, Soma, it's also important to see that how women have engaged to ensure the cultural value continues over a generation. Right. And that is through festivals. Like you have all the festivals are in conjunction with forest and harvesting. So when you have in Chhattisgarh or Jharkhand, you have this festival where you first offer it to the nature before you start consuming or before you start selling it. So the concept of economic is still a very it's not so much ingrained in the forest dependent and indigenous communities in many parts of the world, including in India, where you see culture plays a very strong role in terms of how it is valued.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We may want to take a few more questions if there are any. So I'll just open up the space.
There's a question by Andrila about Tendu, if I can answer that.
Okay. Yeah, please.
So she's asking about, I think, Panchgao example where Tendu harvest was stopped. So actually, Panchgao is a very interesting case because they stopped Tendu harvest with the aim that Tendu ultimately is used for producing cigarettes, and they did not want to sort of encourage that kind of.
Just a quick one sentence on what Tendu is for our general audience. It's a leaf.
Yeah, Tendu is harvested from a dry deciduous tree. The leaf is particularly used for producing kind of cigarette, which is for rolling tobacco, basically. The cover of the cigarette is the Tendu leaf, which is a dried Tendu leaf, and then the cigarette is rolled through it. And there's a huge economy on this particular leaf in India, at least. The estimates are around 12 million. So to sort of opt out of this kind of huge economy is a great act of revolution, sort of, to not participate in this, taking the position that it eventually leads to addiction and things. But particularly in case of Pachgaon was also possible because they have other sources of livelihood. So it's a conscious choice between a sustainable livelihood option, which for them was bamboo, and then looking for also restoring their forest by not harvesting Tendu and allowing it to grow, because when you harvest Tendu, you're actually hacking off the tree many times. You're pruning the tree to make the leaves harvestable. So this kind of choice happens also because there are ways and means that they have balanced their livelihoods through other sources. So
they've also strengthened their water bodies, right?
Yes.
They've also strengthened water bodies to get the fish to supplement their diet so that they don't have to depend upon the income from the Tendu to buy any other resources in the market. So by doing the community-based planning of the landscape, they've been able to take this approach forward. Yeah, great.
Do we have more additional questions for Soma and Anuja? Please feel free to share or type them down if you are not comfortable in sharing.
Damayanti, Ellen wants to
ask. Oh, perfect. Ellen.
Hello,
our deputy coordinator
evening.
of the division.
Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ellen Damayanti. People in India call me Damayanti. I'm from Indonesia. First time I went to India was for my research in 2005 and 2006. And then at that time, just like what you mentioned, that I went to Kerala. My research area was Kerala. So just like what you mentioned, all of the forest guard were men, but at that time I also found one, what was the position that managing the whole wildlife sanctuary? So there is this woman who managed a wildlife sanctuary in in Kerala. And then the next visit to India was in 2019, December, just before the pandemic. So I went to Uttarakhand. It's on the border of Nandur Wildlife Sanctuary. So I went to villages there. There was an evaluation, environmental and social impact assessment there for a project. And then I found that I don't know if this is an empowerment for women, because in some of the villages they have this kind of arrangement. For example, if two period of village head is men, then the next one will be women. That's the first. The second is that also there are some above forest guard, but below the head of the village or the sanctuary. I don't know what is the name of the
divisional forest officer.
Maybe DFO? No, below that. Range officer, yeah. So also women. So I don't know, maybe this is in Uttarakhand only, or it is the whole country already adopting or providing women with a chance for working in forestry. So I'd like to hear that from both of you.
Anuja, would you like to go first?
Actually, I don't know much about this, so I would rather.
So I'll be happy to take that then. Regarding the issue of women in the forest department, there has been a policy shift, and they have tried to recruit more and more women, but we have to understand the genesis of that idea. You know, when I mentioned that the women were being targeted and called illegal and encroachers in the forest, the women forest guards are being recruited at the grassroots level, at the level of the range, so that they will be part of the beat team. And when women are caught violating or trespassing into the forest boundary, what the forest department claims as its boundary, then the women can capture the truant woman. So the forest department is arming itself with women in the name of recruiting women officials and women functionaries to capture other women. So it is instrumentalizing women to criminalize other women. And I have in my research documented how the women in a particular range where my research was, were serving the water, were cleaning the office, were making sure that the office arrangements were convenient for the officials, but were not given a place at the table for discussion along with the other range officers when I was having a discussion with them about the women's participation in the forest economy. And I pointed this out to them and was told that she has to learn to be a range officer before she can sit at the table. So I asked, is this a job that every forest officer does when they're recruited at the range level? And there was silence. It certainly isn't. So the gender stereotypes and the domestication of women as range officers, even within the beat office, was so evident. It's documented in my PhD thesis, which I did recently only from the IIT Bombay. So if you look at their portal, you might find my paper. It's also documented in my presentations for the Human Rights Commissioner on environment. So yeah, these are realities that women are contending with and are having to deal with. Now, there are some women who are at the senior levels. The chief conservator of forests from Rajasthan, for instance, have just retired. And during the COVID pandemic, she initiated the process of setting up kitchen gardens with forest-based communities so that they would have access to livelihood resources and would not have to foray into the forest. She was doing this because they had started camper forestry and the land had been diverted. But women were happy to even get this little bit because they could then have food on the table for their families. They're still challenging the loss of the land to the camper scheme, which is the diversion of forest resources. But this helped them to negotiate the immediate crisis in their households, right? So it's a double whammy, actually. Women are being allowed into this forest department, but the terms of that engagement are being defined by the roles that they are made to perform. There are very few who are at the senior positions who will speak out or be able to represent women's interests, women's issues, and gender perspectives within the work of the forest department. And that is why I think it's important to talk to both men and women in their training processes as well as officials, because not every, I truly believe that not every man sitting in that position is masculinist at heart. He also wants to claim this role of ecological well-being. He also wants to be a part of the story of restoration and democratization to allow communities to engage in this process. So that it's critical for these kind of dialogues, these processes of interface, and if it's possible to bring them to the table for discussions and direct interface with women in communities so that these issues can be ironed out. An example from Anuja's area is how women negotiated against a mining factory. Now that lease has come up. Another thing, Purabi, I'd like to mention here is while people were in lockdown and were being told that they cannot budge out of their households, the same national government has allowed for 40 projects were given sanction during that same lockdown period for mining in the same areas where the tribal communities live, which means that the truckers, the mining agencies were allowed to work as an essential activity, as an essential economic activity. They were allowed to perform the tasks of mining, but people were not allowed to forage in the forests. So this kind of dilemma has really caused a lot of discontent within communities, which can only be resolved without conflict through peaceful negotiation and through sitting across the table and understanding each other's vantage point and the need for ecological well-being overall.
On this note, I would like to conclude this webinar session. We can continue having an informal discussion. Those who have time, we have a interaction with Soma. Anuja has to go for another presentation she has. And so we take this opportunity to thank both Anuja and Somaji for really a lively discussion that we had, and wish we had a little bit more time to have a conversation with all the other audiences, but I'm sure it brought a lot of enriching knowledge about what India, in particular women and forest policy can mean in next coming decade to change or to bring a kind of a development that can be a stepping stone for many other countries and for global context. So on that note, I would like to say thank you so much for your time, and looking forward for more interactions with both of you.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to all the participants for joining us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Purabi. Thank you all.
Thank you.
I think Takeshi, hi.
Oh, I Thomas-san.
Thomasen.
Hi. Hello.
Oh, hello.
Hello.
Purabi, may I lead? Or are there any hanging questions? I can take 10 minutes.
Maybe yeah, please.
Do you want me to stay for 10 minutes or I can leave?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please stay.
Okay.
Yes, Thomasen.
May I talk related about your session?
Please do.
Because recently I'm working or studying about the role of forest for disaster risk reduction. And I think such role of forests are the same for men and women. Both men and women see the forest as for the kind of green infrastructure of safety or saving life. I think that is the last point you're saying, some ecological note value of the forest. And I'm not sure about how people see the role of forest or such role of forest. And then are there any difference between the men and women to the specific role of forest?
Okay. Would you like me to respond to that?
Yeah.
If possible.
Okay. It is both men and women are part of those communities living with the forests, right? But their roles, their gender roles are very different in how they relate to the forests. For women, it is a matter of everyday practice, having to forage for leaves for their animals, take their goats for grazing, bring back fuel wood that is dry and lying on the ground for their household fires to burn to cook the food. They need the forest resources for food, for fuel, as well as for fodder. And these are the roles that have traditionally been assigned to women. Now, for the men in the communities where we live and work, the men's roles have been much more about engaging with the forest when, for instance, there are heavy loads to be carried. So if it is a small bundle of bamboo to be carried from the forest, the women will carry the head load. And they'll do that every day. But if there are larger logs to be carried and bigger loads to be carried, then it would be the men for going into the forest. And their relationship with the forest then becomes related to the roles that they are performing in the forest, right? And that is the gender differentiated understanding of forests in the everyday practice of managing of forests. And if that knowledge system doesn't come to the table informing you how forest management needs to happen, taking into consideration the everyday needs, uses, and practices to sustain the forests, women are also aware of which species of grasses the elephant will depend upon, which species of grasses will the porcupines want to live with, which species of bushes will the wild boar want to keep its children secure from the predator lions or something. So they are aware of these. They know which tubers are available under the shadow of which tree and why that tree is necessary. The tuber will not grow if the tree is not there, you know. So this interconnectedness of nature itself has become the knowledge system that has been imbibed into the wisdom of women very often. Similarly, in the area where I did my research in Rajasthan, I found that animal care, caring for the animals that are injured, the joints of the animal, was the role that the men in the community performed. There were a few men who had that knowledge, and they knew about the herbs, about the tree species, about that particular set of knowledge. So they were also knowledge holders, but their knowledge was of a different category from the knowledge that the women in their community had. And each system of knowledge is legitimate and necessary and needs to be validated. But recognizing both the role of men and women and the wisdom that comes with that role is where we want to take forest policy. And if that doesn't happen, then I'm afraid forest policy will actually be blindsided and will be destroying ecologies by taking only a one-sided view. We need a balanced view, a yin-yang view of how ecologies can flourish and people can flourish within ecologies. I hope I'm clear about that point.
Thank you. I feel somewhat different, not in the issue, but the issue of like urban and rural areas. Even in Japan, let's say the policymaker in mainly the big city or in big city, and they decide the policy. But those who really managing forest is living in the forested area. And in the for global perspective, in our country, more people thinking about conservation of tropical forest. But sometimes we forgot about there are people who really depend on the local resources. And of course, both parties have the, see the value of forest, but from very different direction. And they do not sit together and do not discuss, do not exchange ideas. That is very,
Yes, this is also true in India. We find that those who join the forest department as a cadre of officers, especially the Indian Forest Service, are people who have the classroom knowledge of the forest and have engaged perhaps in some amount of adventure tourism or trekking or, exploring environment as a sport. Very few of them would have actually engaged with understanding how communities live with forests. Now in India, more than 80% of the rural economy is dependent upon the land and land-based resources. 8% of our rural population is known to be indigenous people. These people occupy more than 20% of the land. The Forest Department claims that the forest lands having expanded to about 25% of our land. I believe it is about 18% in reality. Now, if 18% of our land is forests and is occupied by 8% of our population, the reason for that is pretty clear, that those ecologies can only sustain with that kind of a population. And when you start diverting the forests to different uses, and that space is shrinking, these communities, as well as the other species that are living in those forests, are threatened and are at points of extinction. So there is a campaign, for instance, in the northeast of India to protect the hornbill, to protect the pangolin by communities, simply because they see the value of restoring these species in the chain of species in their region, because the imbalances will have untold and unprecedented impacts on other species as well. And this understanding comes from their embedded knowledge. If I were to share a film that has recently been made by Green Hub, I think I have a couple of their slides here, if I may share those. May I, Purabi?
Yes, please.
Okay, here we go. This is getting a bit, I don't want it to become a monologue.
I'm sure people are eager to hear you, and maybe they are interested because they're staying back. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So this photograph is of two communities in different places where they have tried to restore livelihoods to themselves when they are being denied the access to the forests. They have negotiated. In the first picture, the team in Assam has set up training centers for weaving so that the communities can find alternative incomes and prevent them from going to the forest to collect their daily needs. But the irony is that these forests where they used to forage for their daily needs are also forests which are being diverted for palm oil and rubber plantations. So you see, the criminalization happens of the local population, but the commercial interests are occupying that space and destroying that forest in a much greater way. So it is, again, the capitalist forces working with the post-colonial agenda of forest as territory that is capturing the resources of the forest and causing the destruction of the forest. And yet these people are being resorting to building up alternate livelihoods because their lives are at stake. So this kind of ironic mismatch of the kind of policies is causing a destruction of the economy, of the population, causing other kinds of problems. While even from your country, I'm saying this, I hope there will be some way that we can follow up on this. The JICA projects in the Northeast are promoting this kind of monocultural plantation in what used to be ecologically diverse forests that communities were managing on their own. And this kind of forestry is causing a lot of devastation in this very area where this woman is learning to weave. We find that monocropping of palm oil and rubber is happening. And these are commercial plantations that will likely give their produce for export purposes and add to GDP, but not add to well-being and happiness in these communities or in communities overall. When there is discontent in one community, it will spill over to the community overall. And ecological discontent is likely to affect all of us, as we are seeing with the COVID pandemic. I think I will take your permission to wind up now.
Sure. I'm really glad that you could bring in all the perspectives, which is so difficult to bring it in 1 hour, and to kind of, share all the different stories from around India, because as such, when we talk about India, it's just not one standalone country. You have so much of diversity within the country, and in terms of language, in terms of culture, and to manage this diverse range of forested landscape also then kind of brings those challenges. And you have nicely covered all the different regions from different communities. So thank you so much again for joining us today. And it was a real honor to have you here with us at the IUFRO World Day. Thank you so much.
Thank you for a very patient audience and for the opportunity to interact with you. I hope that we can all learn and work together at some point. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I leave from here. It's nearly 9 o'clock in night. Have a nice day. I enjoyed. Thank you.
Thank you for joining. Thank you. Really very nice to see you, Thomas-san. Have a very good night. We'll be in touch.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thanks a lot. I saw you patiently waiting since the before the webinar started, almost half an hour. So thank you for joining. I hope you found it interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I found it interesting. Actually, I tried to join yesterday in some of them, but I had a very difficult internet access. Even today, I was breaking out in between, but I could join. This was one of the interesting events I was eagerly waiting to join.
Oh, so happy to hear that. And thanks.
Yeah,
I'm glad that your internet worked perfectly well.
Yeah,
and you could also use video. So very nice.
Yeah.
And you are from Bangladesh?
No, I'm from India. I'm from West
You're
Bengal.
from India because you used, I saw Sundarban, so I assumed you will be from Bangladesh. Okay,
no,
so
I am
India.
from India. I am working in Sundarbans, India. I myself am a forestry graduate and a master's, and I did my master's in FRI, Forest Research Institute in India, and that's where I came close to many of the forest officials as well. And I in this IUFRO event, I came as an ex-IFSA official, International Forestry Student Association official, since I have been official for 2 years, 1 year board member, another year as the International Policy Commissioner. Head of the commission, International Policy Commission. And then since I graduated, I mastered, and right now I have been working with Jadavpur University on this Sundarban project. So I'm no more a student, so I'm no more part of that, but I'm very close to Michael Klein, and we have been part of some consulting projects, and I met him in the Asia Pacific Forestry Commission in 2019. So it was we are very close, and so it was from his office I got invited in this event, and so I registered and I made a point that I stay and attend. So, yeah.
It's really great. Maybe you can share your email ID and we will be in touch, because you might be interested in some of our division's work. So we will keep you posted.
I would love to be. I would love to be. I would love to be. And in fact, the questions I put were actually from my field experiences in Sundarbans and my field experiences during my Uttarakhand days. I did my graduation from Kumaon University. So that was also in Uttarakhand. And for my master's and my graduation thesis, I worked on Sundarbans. So I find the way of, we see the Sundarbans people and their relationship with the mangroves in these landscapes are much different from that of the other forest dependent communities. So that is something I am still processing. Like when we say they are very much ingrained and they're very much respectful towards the forest, I see, yes, there are few people still respectful towards the forest, but there's a lot of changes, transitions, and the over the generations, the culture, the knowledge is being lost here in this part of the landscape.
And that changes the entire perspective towards forest and forest management. And I suppose that brings us to a very big question about what happens when you disconnect people from their forest, and what happens to the next generation, how they view forest then, and how it continues to kind of build the challenges within the community. It's no longer the community fighting against the outsider, but now it is within the community that is kind of trying to fight against different perspectives, because there has been this disconnection between forest and people. And I suppose it brings out a very important, interesting study. Maybe Sundarban, this entire aspect can also talk about different parts in India. For example, in Kutch, where the Maldharis have been practicing traditional forest, whatever the forest they have in the dry land areas. And there you see the Maldhari, the pastoralist children are moving out of that area. And to manage that biodiversity without having the connection is something that that is very challenging. And you see some young children, they still continue to live there, and as a youth they know to navigate the area without having a map or anything, and that deserted area. Whereas you see the people who have, the youth who have left the place, they have no connection, and then they don't feel the need, or they don't see the richness of that land. So I'm glad you brought out that point. And
actually, when I did my master's thesis, I found some of the households not even very well acquainted, very well identifying the species around them. And the sentence I put, it was actually being told to me by few children and women of the area who were cutting mercilessly the forest, and they had in their backyard very good few species as well. When I asked, why are you not lopping these plantations which have been done through social forestry in your villages? I was told that these are our trees and they are government's trees. And that difference, that they are government trees, they do not belong to us, that non-belongingness creates a huge difference in exploitation and conservation.
Absolutely. It's nice to see another Bengali woman sitting in front of my screen talking about the same thing that I never imagined it will happen. And so I'm very happy to see that. So nice to meet you again.
Nice to meet you,
Indrila, right?
Yes, Indrila.
We'll be in touch. And I see you posted your Gmail ID, right?
Email address,
Gmail.
yes.
Yeah, perfect.
Ymail, so, it's Ymail, not Gmail.
It's not Gmail, it's Ymail?
No, it's Ymail. It's Ymail.
Okay.
No,
okay.
it was not a mistake. It is Ymail.
Okay.
It is not Gmail.
I didn't hear that before.
Yeah, because the Gmail account belongs to someone else. I don't know. And many of my messages do go to that person and I have to correct.
Okay. So good that we clarified here. So we'll be in touch, and I look forward to having more interactions with you. Yeah, you have a wonderful day and a great evening. Bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.